And joining us now on the debate, in the nation's capital, Mazen Chouaib, former executive director of the National Council on Canada-Arab Relations. And back here in studio, Randall Hansen, Canada Research Chair in Immigration and Governance at the University of Toronto, Anna Korteweg, sociology professor at the University of Toronto, and Michael Coren, author of As I See It and the host of his eponymously named television program on CTS. Good to have everybody around the table here. Mazen, good to have you on the line again from the nation's capital. It's been a long time. Good to see you, my friend.
Good to see you.
Well, I guess we've invited you all here today because there have been an increasing number of incidents highlighting tensions between Muslims and various Western European nations. And to that end, I want to read something here from the BBC News and then we'll chat. Michael, if you would, first graphic. In 2004, filmmaker Theo van Gogh is murdered by a Dutch-born Muslim after making a film about Islamic oppression of women. January 2009, Dutch Freedom Party leader Geert Wilders charged with inciting hatred after calling for a ban of the Quran. 2005, the Danish newspaper Jyllands Postens publishes cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, an act considered blasphemous to many Muslims. Additionally, some of the cartoons portrayed Muhammad in an unflattering light. We all remember the protests, the rioting around the world. Dozens of people were killed. Cartoonist Kurt Vestergaard remains in hiding after an attempt on his life last month. June 2009, French President Nicolas Sarkozy proposes a ban on women wearing burqas in public. December 2009, a Swiss referendum brings about a ban on the construction of any new minarets in that country. Okay, let's unpack this a bit. Anna, to you first. It's easy to look at these various events and conclude that Europe is witnessing a growing wave of intolerance towards Muslims. Do you believe that this is in fact the case?
And yes and no.
Okay, you're allowed to say that. Now tell me what you mean.
So what I mean is that on the one hand, if you read them like that, clearly there's a trend and it doesn't look good, right? On the other hand, when you do what I do and you go to Holland and you talk to people and you see people really trying to figure out what it means to live together in a way that is about dialogue and that is about struggling through complex issues. I would actually say there is, at the same time as there is a heightened kind of alarmist debate that draws on these kinds of images, there's also simultaneously processes unfolding that are about creating tolerance. And by that I mean tolerance as in the ability to live together despite being different.
Okay, let's go. I'm going to go around the horn here, get everybody on this. Mazen, why don't you give me your view on that?
Sure. I obviously, clearly, like Anna said, if you put them one after the other, there's a clear intolerance towards Muslims. But the way I see it, I don't see it as directed only against Muslims. I see it as its historical background. If you look at the history of it, this is related to anti-immigration, anti-immigrants in many of these European countries. It's just now it's taking on Islamophobic tendencies because people, the symbolism of Islam is quite present, and especially since September 2001, we're seeing it as direct against Muslims. But I would say that the same feelings or the same issues that are facing the Muslims are facing Africans in most of these European countries as well, and other immigrant communities.
Michael?
My family were immigrants to the UK from Eastern Europe, Jews, and I'm incredulous actually. The idea that Europe is anti-immigrant. If there's anti-immigrant culture and a fundamental notion of being an anti-immigrant state, we must look, I think, to much of the Islamic world where there's very little immigration at all. Europe has welcomed immigrants. The British example is a very good one to use because a whole group of people came in the 50s and 60s from South Asia in particular. And if you juxtapose the Hindu, Sikh, and Muslim experience, it's very, very interesting, quite enlightening. Hindu and Sikh don't have to assimilate. Why should you have to assimilate? But fitted in, became part of British culture. Almost unheard of to see a Hindu or a Sikh in a British prison. Enormous embourgeoisement, large middle class, part of the British, the fabric of British society. Muslims who came at the same time who faced the same racism, and there was racism, and the same opportunities. Terrible crime problems, large prison population, political violence, extremism, and so on. Not everyone, of course. But we have to ask, what is different about South Asian Hindu, South Asian Sikh? And Sikhs face the worst racism because of the visibility, and South Asian Muslim. Well, I'm afraid it's not Islamophobia to say, well, perhaps religion is a different factor here. And I don't think the French people or the British people or the Dutch or Scandinavians are anti-immigrant. On the contrary, I think they're pro-tolerance and diversity, and they're offended when a specific group says, we don't believe in that.
Randall.
Yeah, I largely agree with Michael. I mean, if you want to make an argument about anti-immigration sentiment in Europe, you'd have to explain to me why it is that France, Britain, and Germany in the last 10 years, and I can talk about the Netherlands, have all opened the doors to more immigrants, have expanded immigration controls. And the sort of notion out there that there were these Muslims quietly minding their own business and then Europeans decided to make lives difficult for them cannot be sustained. Now, one could say that Europeans overreacted, but not talk about 7/7, to not talk about Madrid. You did mention the murder of Van Gogh, which was a brutal act of Islamicist violence. I mean, this is partly a reaction to these events. So I think there's evidence of tensions and problems, but to say this is a simple matter of European intolerance towards the other, that just doesn't work.
Mazen, you want to come back at that?
Of course. If you go back and look at evidence, Polish immigrants, Italian immigrants, Spanish immigrants who came to Europe in the 50s, 1950s, all experienced intolerance and all experienced violence of sorts. There's enough evidence of that. The issue, of course, the issue of Muslims, with the political problems becoming religious problems and becoming, part of the conflict in Europe. This is adding fuel to the fire. I'm not at all saying that Muslims are integrating well, but if you look at the numbers, for example, in terms of numbers of immigrants who are, their education levels are half, if not less than half of what the education levels of the main population. In terms of the lack of jobs, 20% immigrants are jobless. Rates are across Europe almost 20% and more. Of the immigrant population is uneducated. There are a lot of issues related to the policies of under which these immigrants are coming to Europe.
Michael wants to come back at you.
I really do, because I'd like to hear the evidence, by the way, for this violence against Poles and Italians that you mentioned. If you want to talk about violence, for example, and racism, we mentioned Poles in East Europe. The Jewish community, let's take Britain or France or Sweden. In Malmo, the third city in Sweden, I'm not sure, almost the entire Jewish community leaving now because of anti-Semitism. You think that's blonde-haired, blue-eyed Scandinavians? Every single act has been from people identified with Islam. In the United Kingdom...
Recently, yes, Michael, recently,
yes. You made these comments, and often people say, oh, they must be true. I'm sorry, the violence against Poles and Italians, of course people face racism. It's inevitable. There will always be some sort of people who don't like others.
It was related to jobs and the economy, too.
However, today in Britain, the rates of anti-Semitic attacks, almost unheard of in Britain, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, are now becoming appallingly high in various inner cities. And again, it's not the far right, it's young Muslims. Why are the host population being asked to deal with their own racism and Islamophobia when the divisions seem to come not from them but from other communities entirely?
Let me go to Anna. Hang on one second,
Sure.
Mazen, because I want to get Anna into this as well. We're kind of having this debate a little bit in this country with the reasonable accommodation issues that have come up in Quebec over the past number of years. Can you help us understand what you think European countries are doing to help accommodate and integrate Muslim immigrants into the broader society?
Well, actually, I want to come back to something that Randall was saying, like people are open to immigration, and that's evidence of the fact that there is then, that's tolerance and that's openness across the board. I think what actually happens is that Europeans have a set of principles that they live by and truly believe in that have to do with equality and liberal values and liberal democratic values. But that when it comes to bringing those things into practice, we see consistently that there is discrimination in the labor market, that there are problems in education, streaming people through into higher education who are from a Muslim. And as Mazen said, actually, up until 10 years ago, we weren't talking about Muslims. We were talking about Turks and Moroccans, and that it was ethnicity that has become religious-sized, and that's a very complex process. But there are consistent, I would say there's consistent evidence that while people are willing to put their principles, Europeans, whoever they are, by the way, European governments will put their principles out and will let people in based on those principles. What happens then once people have entered? And the social processes that unfold definitely are processes that involve discrimination that is systemic.
Well, in Chinese? University population in the UK, for example.
Yeah.
Look at the Hindu population and Chinese population. And in fact, it's now overrepresented, as Jews were. Now, there are many young Muslims at university, but part of the resistance and reluctance to be part of higher education in British culture is not coming from British people, some of whom are racist, of course, or from French or anyone else, but from their communities themselves, who say, do not become part of what is essentially anti-Islamic.
Or at least
Michael, if I may, Michael, I'm not disagreeing with you that there are problems within the Muslim community. It's rife with problems. There are a lot of issues related to the issues of integration, accepting the, liberal values, and all these factors that play into what we're seeing today in terms of the violence, the attacks on in Europe and other places. Totally, I agree with you. I myself. This is something that I feel. When I get on an airplane, I fly every 2 weeks. I'm going to the Middle East and to Europe. Regularly. I fly on an airplane, I see a Muslim reading a book, the Quran, I look at it and I start wondering what's going to happen, and I'm from a Muslim background. So let me qualify this. Obviously there are problems within the Muslim community, obviously there are issues within the Muslim community, but what the fear that people are stoking against Muslims is not helping eliminate the problem and allowing Europeans to move on within some sort of a multicultural a policy framework that allows Muslims to be integrated, well integrated into their communities, and not to just say we are a multicultural society, but create the policies and implement the policies that will allow people to become integrated. Because if you keep them disenfranchised, some people, and we're seeing this in the Middle East, those who are disenfranchised from the political system, from the social system, will ultimately, some of them, not all, obviously we remember that we're talking about a small minority here, will lead to taking them into violent behavior and manifestation.
Okay, Randall wants a
frustration.
response on this one.
Yeah, no, I mean, where we agree is on the importance of work and the fact that the majority, or not majority, but large numbers, 20 to 40% of Muslim communities in Europe are unemployed. We should be talking about that much more and much less about
20 to 40%.
Yeah, depending on the neighborhood, depending on the
number.
country.
That is huge.
And we should be talking about that rather than these sort of symbolic cultural issues. So much of this conversation is a huge distraction. However, an uncomfortable truth that part of the problem with unemployment is it's partly valuing education, as Michael said, but it's partly a welfare state that offers benefit levels above the market wage in the context of a Muslim population, which is largely unskilled. In that context, that can lead to only one thing, which is unemployment. What I would also like to say, and I think there's some agreement between us here, is that Europeans, again, whoever they are, themselves need to do something, but it's not multiculturalism they need. Multiculturalism is frankly what they have. You come to this country, be Turkish, be Moroccan, we don't think you're European anyway, live in your community, speak your language, go to your faith schools, live your own lives. What they need is quite the opposite, integration, a meaningful path for Moroccans to become French, Turks,
But is this
German.
multiculturalism?
No, this is integration. It's quite the opposite.
No,
of
I'm
multiculturalism.
talking about multiculturalism as they're practicing it in Europe.
Well,
It's totally different than ours.
Multiculturalism means a million things to a million different people in Canada, so it depends what you're talking.
I think we know what it means to a Turk living in Germany trying to, be a guest worker in that country, right? Multiculturalism means something very different to that person than it does to somebody here.
It keeps you as a second and third class citizen for a long time in Europe.
Possibly. Sorry, Michael.
But Germany has a specific issue, the idea of guest arbeit, and you're far more qualified than I am in this area, but people were brought in on a temporary basis to do the work that Germans did not want to do. Now, there are some implicit moral problems with that approach. Most of Europe took in people, come into our country and be part of our nation. There was seldom an insistence, maybe France is a little different, that you had to be British or you had to be Swedish. The French have always had this notion of what it means to be French, which is not being English, not being Anglo-Saxon, not being American. Even with Huguenots, with French Protestants, are they completely French, although the country is secular? French Jews, an ambivalent position. With Islam, and I do have more of a sympathy for the Muslim community because they're living in these awful suburbs around some beautiful cities. They're allowed to shop in the local stores but not work in them. And it's not just Muslims, of course. There are non-Muslims, tend to be from ethnic minorities in those areas too. And when the rioting took place, it was almost inevitable. I saw it in Britain 10, 15 years before that. But there does seem to be a consistent issue with Islamic communities throughout Europe that doesn't apply to other immigrant groups. And that has to be addressed, and it's not Islamophobic to address it.
Let me follow up with you on this, Michael, about whether or not special rights are appropriate in certain circumstances. And I think it was this past weekend when there was an Islamic leader, I wish I had a better description than that, but an Islamic leader somewhere in Britain who said, for example, picking up on Mazen's issue about the airports, full body scans, these new highfalutin machines that are coming in, full body scans for Muslims are inappropriate because they reveal too much, and that raises a whole host of religious issues that are, you know, very, very tricky with some of the Muslim community, violating the Quran and so forth. Should there be an acknowledgement of a quote-unquote special right for those Muslims who do not want to undergo those body scans because they think it violates their religious principles?
The problem is, should there be a specific right of anyone to say no if they feel compromised? I mean, I feel sorry for the person having to look at me if they can see me naked. It would be an awful thing to have to do. But
We have something in common, Mike.
Because the deep irony here is, without even going close to the issues of racial profiling, because people aren't mentioning race, the idea of profiling who is a potential suspect in an airline bombing, obviously Islam is an issue, and the very people who are saying, no, we cannot go through these scanners are people of the Muslim faith. I don't think this man speaks for all Muslims. Quite a few of the people who are working there behind these scanners are of the Muslim faith, for goodness sake. So again, this is the vast majority of people want a peaceable working society. But look, if it hadn't been for various terrorist attacks and what is going on geopolitically, most people would say, give them whatever rights they want. A few people would object, but they wouldn't matter very much. It's because of the dynamic between Islam and the West.
Anna, could I get you to address that issue of whether special rights are appropriate in these circumstances?
You know, it's such a loaded question when you phrase it that way, right? At this point, we've pretty much rejected, I think, across the board that special rights, they don't fly anymore, as it were, in the European context. What I think, though, what is important is to make sure that you give voice to people so that everybody can sit around the table. So what I've been noticing in the work that I do, and coming back to the question of integration, so when it comes to creating policies that enable people to fully participate in society, regardless of where they're from, it helps to have representatives of their community around the table. And it helps to have them go back to their communities and create dialogue. Those things just help. Does that mean special rights? I mean, my sense is, like your example of the scanners, my sense is that there's other people who are going to have trepidation about that, and we can still frisk people. Like, if there's an easy solution, why not?
Okay,
right?
let me try this with Mazen. Mazen, I'm going to read you something that Tariq Ramadan published a couple of months ago. Over the last 2 decades, Islam has become connected to so many controversial debates: violence, extremism, freedom of speech, gender discrimination, and forced marriage, to name a few. It is difficult for ordinary citizens to embrace this new Muslim presence as a positive factor. That was published in the Christian Science Monitor in December. Can you react to that quote for me?
Of course, but the problem is that you have people are mixing what is happening in the Muslim and the Arab world with what is happening in Europe and within these communities. There's no disconnect or there's no separation being made between the two. And relatively speaking, the problems that are happening in the Middle East are being reflected also in these communities. So in people's minds, in the European mind or American mind or Canadian mind, they are one and the same. And this is where there needs to be a level of dialogue and discussions. And for the community itself, it needs to be out there speaking about these issues and making those, or making clear separation, firewalls between what they're dealing with and what is going on around the world. Because when we talk about, for example, child marriages in Yemen at 6, 8, 10 years old girls getting married, this is not happening in Canada or in Europe. But these things are reflected on the community in Canada. And I think this level of ignorance, this level of or debate that needs to happen is not happening at a level whereby people can understand the differences between the two.
Okay, let me follow up with Randall then. Ramadan's quotation, if you take another interpretation of it, could also be read as trying to portray Muslims as kind of hapless bystanders in people's impressions of them. Somehow they're merely passive vessels to be filled by the misperceptions of the other. What do you think about that notion?
Well, no, clearly, I mean, that's not the case on a number of levels, partly because some of these horrendous acts have been committed by Muslims, but also more positively because there are actors across Europe who are staking out counter positions, members of the German Muslim Council in Germany. I'm tempted to say Tariq Ramadan, though I think we could debate that. He's possibly a moderate voice, possibly an extreme voice. It depends on your point of view. But I think an important point that Mazen made is or we'll get at what he said, is within a European context, we shouldn't over-aggregate this category of Muslims either. I mean, when you're talking about the Turkish community in Germany, where there's a strong secular tradition, that's a very different dynamic. Kreuzberg is the most segregated neighborhood in Germany. It's a wonderfully integrated neighborhood, the sort of neighborhood that Richard Florida would love to live in. You know, gays, Turks, white affluent Germans all mixing together. And again, the British community is different from those two, and the one from which a lot of these problems emerge. So when we talk about Europe, often we're talking about Britain.
Let me put another word out there that's not quite Europe, but close to Europe. Anna, people talk today about Eurabia. What do they mean when they say that?
You know, I had to look it up for you. I wasn't quite sure. I think different things, again. One interpretation is that there's a concerted effort by Arab governments to infiltrate Europe through sending their population there. The other interpretation, I believe, is to the demographic shifts that some people will predict, but more careful analyses of demography suggest probably will not take place quite as dramatically by the fact that immigrant families often have more children will create a difference in the population.
It's not a compliment, though, is it?
It's not a compliment. No, I don't like the term, which is part of why I had to look it up. I was like, some terms I try to avoid.
I actually think Arabs are running away from their own governments. This is what will happen.
Well, that's, I think, more
this
accurate.
is ludicrous to suggest that Arab governments have a plan. If the Arab governments had a plan, they wouldn't be in this position.
I don't think that's actually what it does mean, though. I mean, it's a specific concept coined by I think, by a woman, an Egyptian Jewish one by origin. But it's not just the attitude of Muslims, be they Arab or not, because in many of the, or in Britain, for example, the former empire, it's South Asian overwhelmingly. It's also the attitude of some people in the elites of European society who are very comfortable with always taking the side of Muslim states against America, against Israel, against the West, against Britain, and so on. So it's a cultural and political spasm plus immigration from Muslim countries. And it's a loaded term, of course, and I mean, it's quite offensive in a way, but there are some in the Muslim community who've rather embraced it. And they do have aspirations that Europe should be a predominantly Muslim continent. I don't think it'll happen.
Well, let's show the numbers here. Randall, why don't you take us through these? Everybody here in the studio, check the monitors. And here are the percentages of Islam in Europe today. There's Europe. Let's color code this map here and we can bring it up. You can see in the green areas, less than 1% of the population is Muslim. And then the red and the orange and the slightly less orange. And then I'm not even sure what that last color is, but areas where it's more than 80% population. France, of course, has the largest Muslim population of any country in Europe. And Randall, let's ask the
map
let's
is
just
wrong, actually. Holland shows green. Sorry.
Holland shows green, and
It's 6%.
And
so
it's
it
6?
should be red.
It should be red.
Yeah, just to.
Okay. Okay, we'll take your word for that.
Yeah.
Randall, the uncomfortable question is, based on those numbers, is Europe at the risk of becoming Eurabia?
Well, I mean, clearly the evidence for the moment shows that you're through family unification, particularly, also through asylum seeking, you're getting large numbers of immigrants who are Muslim, be they Arab or from another part of the world, as Michael pointed out. And birth rates among Muslim communities are notably higher than in quote-unquote native indigenous communities. For in Germany, among non-Muslim Germans or Germans overall, the average is 1.3, which is extremely low. So you're going to see a sharp increase in Muslim populations in these countries. To call this Eurabia is prejudging the argument. I mean, the question to me seems to be this. If these communities are going to increase, and if you're going to have large-scale immigration, particularly of the unskilled, do you need to change structures in the labor market, in integration policies, perhaps in citizenship policies, to cope with that and to sustain the sort of democratic values that hopefully everybody, including the majority of the Muslim community, supports? Well, that's the kind of intelligent element of the Eurabia
Let me go to
question.
Mazen on that, and then I'll get some more reaction around the table here. Clearly, the idea behind this, Mazen, is that some people are not comfortable with the notion of, because of higher birth rates, et cetera, this kind of, for lack of a better expression, Islamic tide coming across Europe, which will take away all of the kind of small L liberal rights that people have enjoyed for centuries and impose some kind of Sharia law across Europe. That's the fear. What's the likelihood of that happening as you look at it?
It's unlikely, completely unlikely. I think once we have these issues of terrorism kind of calming down and people starting to get back to a thoughtful discussion on the issues, dialogue, they will go back to the natural inclination of these communities. A Gallup poll was done not long ago in Europe, it indicated that I think in the 90s, over 46% of French immigrants, or sorry, Moroccan Arab immigrants to Europe believed in secular values and did not understand Islam in the rigid definitions that people are accepting right now. There's a lot of these discussions that are happening right now that we need to take within the context of the global conflict that is happening right now,
Okay,
terrorism,
but I do need to follow up,
and all
though.
these things.
I do need to follow up with this, Mazen, and that is, you said it's unlikely.
Totally unlikely.
Unlikely is a long way away from impossible. And maybe
Oh, it's impossible. I'll be clearer. It's impossible because this is we're talking about a minority. We're talking if you look at Canada, for example, we have the population of Muslims in Canada is less than 3%. Are we discussing that in Canada? Are we talking about Muslims taking over Canada? Not at all, because most Muslims are well integrated in Canada. Some of the most successful examples of integration are from the Arab and the Muslim communities in Canada. So we can, if these policies that we're following in Canada, and hopefully we'll have an honest discussion about them in Canada, are used in Europe and in France and other places, I think this debate will not even be, this issue will not be on the radar screen.
Oh, Michael and then Anna.
It's a very different Muslim population in Canada. Now, you can blame British immigration policies, but in Canada you also have a large Arab Christian population, which has changed the nature to an extent of the Arab population. They're the same in the United States. I don't think there's any particular issue in North America at all, really. In Europe, it's very hard to say. Look, there are schools in Europe that are no longer teaching courses on the Holocaust because some Muslim pupils, a lot, have complained. That's an awful thing to happen. On the other hand, there are Muslims in the House of Lords, in the House of Commons, the Muslim MPs, Muslim politicians, Muslim in every walk of life. I don't know. What is worrying, though, is that there's ample evidence of a certain radicalization of young people. So it's not that the second generation, the third generation say, oh, we don't want that anymore. They're saying, we do want that. You may not have wanted it, but we do. You may see it in Canada with the arguments over polygamy. With the redefinition of marriage debate that went on a couple of years ago, there will be a push for polygamy. It won't be the majority in the Muslim community, but there you will see the notion of a liberal interpretation of values, what is marriage, with the thrust of a fairly fundamentalist religious community. And how will we decide?
Well,
so the debate isn't over in this country.
The Muslims might not lead that one. There might be certain colonies in British Columbia that would lead
Exactly,
that one that have nothing to do with Muslims.
I don't think it has much to do with a few rather strange people with beards in British Columbia.
Michael, why are they strange people with beards in British Columbia and they're not, strange people in the Muslim community who want polygamy?
Because the people in British Columbia
it's not accepted by all Muslims, and it's not something that is tolerated.
I never said it was, but the people in British Columbia are so much on the fringes of Christian society or Western society. It's very hard to find anyone who takes them seriously.
And most Muslims will tell you that these Al-Qaeda types and Taliban types are the fringes of Muslim community.
I'm not mentioning Al-Qaeda or Taliban.
But this is the mentality.
No, but sir, Al-Qaeda and Taliban put aside polygamy. I've met a number of Muslims, interviewed a number of Muslims who do say, well, yes, we should certainly consider it, and I understand what they're saying as well. Maybe we should consider it, but let's not pretend it's just a tiny, tiny handful. If you look at the figures, you mentioned the number of Moroccans who believe in secular values. Was it 46%, you said?
Yes.
That means the majority do not. That's a very frightening figure.
Only 20% believed in Islam as a way of life. 46% said no, and the rest of them were they were unconcerned about it or disconcerted.
Just 20%.
Let me get Anna's view on this as well.
I think I'm sort of with Mazen on this in the sense that what the Arabia concept does, what it shows even in this discussion, is it unifies all Muslims under this extremist label. And what we need to look at and what we need to take seriously is that when people live somewhere, there are social processes that unfold. And most immigrants in Holland, most Moroccans, Turkish immigrants in Holland, for example, and elsewhere in Europe as well, move there because they want something from those countries. They want to have a life in those countries. They want to have their kids go to school. They want to be successful. And religion is, to various degrees, parts of their lives. But the Dutch Muslim population, I believe only a third of them is regular mosque attender. So you have, to call these people Muslim is kind of like calling, somebody who goes to church on Christmas a Christian when that isn't really a big part of their life.
Gotcha.
And if we keep insisting on the Muslim label, and then in the context of other labels like Arabia, we keep discussing this potential radicalization, and I think the real danger there is the counter-radicalization that I know you're getting to, of the like Geert Wilders and the ultra-right parties.
Because sensitivity is incredibly important, and anyone who says all Muslims is an idiot, and they should be disregarded immediately. But we've not said that at all. It's a minority of Muslims. However, the damage that can be done, if you speak to the families of victims throughout Europe, people have suffered terribly, and the attacks that aren't even reported in the media, individual attacks on people by Muslims. The cartoon, Kurt Vestergaard, for example, do you know why the cartoons were drawn in the first place? Because one of the main reasons, a man who merely read the Quran, a non-Muslim, to a group of students who were non-Muslim, not to criticize, merely to talk about the Quran, was kidnapped, tortured and beaten up by a Muslim gang in Denmark. There are reasons why some people react to Islamic extremism.
Okay,
but Michael, we're not talking about the attacks against Muslims either, and we're not talking about something that is fundamentally problematic. When these cartoons were published, they attacked the fundamental belief system of the Muslims, and that is the Prophet Muhammad. No, allow me. I think they should be published. I don't care. Sorry.
Let me, forgive me, I want it, because the clock is becoming our enemy quickly here, and I want to make, there's a whole additional chapter to our discussion I want to make sure we get to, and I don't want to debate the whole Muslim cartoon thing here, because we've done that a lot.
It's an example, that's all.
I hear you. Randall, this one to you first. I want you to help us with this paradox here. Europe is largely seen by the West, I think it's fair to say, as being the height of culture in the arts, in humanities, progressive thought, and so on. Europe also, of course, has a terrible history of intolerance towards certain Christian denominations, towards Jews, towards Arabs, towards Muslims, Muslims in the Balkans, now Western European nations. Can you help us understand why such a cultured place occasionally behaves in such an uncultured way?
Easy question. I think you need to break these out again. And I think what you want to say is that the very liberal and progressive Europe that we see today, where there's an entrenched human rights culture, is the result of the brutality of Europe before the war, above all towards the Jews. In many ways, we live in the world in which the Nazis gave to us. Without the Holocaust, the utter delegitimization of racism, a human rights culture firmly entrenched in Europe, a great deal of suspicion of anyone who would demonize any community. The moment a Wilders comes up and criticizes Muslims, there'll be another 3 people who'll say the things that are being very reasonably said around this table. They don't speak for all Muslims, most are peace-loving, things that need to be said. But that seems to be the relationship. And I must say, I'm not suggesting you were doing this, but this notion that the situation of Muslims in contemporary Europe is anything like the situation like Jews in pre-war Europe is simply absurd. On the contrary, they are in fact benefiting from the suffering of those Jews, because it's because of the Holocaust then that we have a human rights culture now.
Mazen, can I get you to weigh in on that paradox?
Of course. I agree with what he just said now, and I think it's not comparable at all to what happened pre-World War, or what happened to the Jews. And thankfully, that is not the case. Otherwise, we haven't learned any lessons from history. But what I'm talking about, what we need to discuss right now is the issues of policies that are making the lives of people difficult, rather than helping people integrate and helping people achieve what they've set out to achieve when they left their countries, and that is to live within a society that is known for its human rights, that is known for its culture. And this is the difficulty that people speak of, and that is, how can you balance, or how can you juxtapose the calls for human rights and arts and culture. On the other hand, we don't defend the rights of people Muslims, for example, or immigrants in Europe, when they are attacked by groups, for example, right-wing groups, or policies that are discriminatory against immigrants and against Muslims, rather than supporting the values of human rites. This is the difficulty here.
Okay,
and I'm not saying that Muslims are doing a good job. I think Muslims have a lot of responsibility.
First of all, not everyone has learnt lessons of history. Take a trip to Iran and you'll realize a lot of people there haven't learned any lessons about the Holocaust.
Go to Cairo, too.
Yes, and many Arab countries too, outside of Persia, that this is embraced. This idea that Muslims are attacked and nothing is done really cannot stand, because in those, and there are attacks on Muslims. There aren't as many, I think, as some people claim, but everyone is wrong, and the police do their job properly. And if you investigate the police investigations in Netherlands, in Denmark, in France, in the UK, in Germany, they've been very successful. There are entire police departments that deal with crimes against minorities.
But can you speak to that whole paradox between how Europe, on the one hand, can be so cultural and so cultured, so progressive on so many things, but yet so intolerant on so many others?
I don't think it is so very intolerant. It goes through, I mean, what happened, of course, during the Second World War was repugnant beyond belief. But some of the most cultured people in Germany were some of the most active supporters of National Socialism was the student union, for goodness sake, and many professors are supportive of Nazism. But I don't see Europe as being intolerant at this stage. Europe is reacting. Look, there are certain minority groups. What you've seen in Europe now, forget the far right, they have very little influence. Why people like Wilders and Van Gogh and the rest of them, they're saying the rights of gay people, the rights of Jews, the rights of women must be protected. It's not the traditional far right Neanderthal approach, and they're saying that the group that is threatening the rights of these minorities is fundamentalist Islam.
But let me follow up on the rights question. Anna, the president of France, says the burqa has no place on French soil. Is that an intolerance?
In my mind, it is.
It is.
Actually, as a matter of fact, yeah. And I'm kicking myself because I haven't been able to find the source, but a French politician said, what will happen, French women will not be able to wear miniskirts anymore if these people get their way. And I think part of that is what's going on is Europe is tolerant, yes. Europe has a strong human rights culture, yes. But one of the big issues here is gender equality that's trotted out again and again. But while there have been great strides made over the last 30 years in gender equality, we're not done with that issue at all amongst the non-immigrant population. But what's happening is by talking again and again about the burqa, the headscarf, etc., we get to avoid some real issues that we still have to deal with: childcare, equal pay for equal work.
Honor killings.
Honor killings are actually, I could tell you a lot about that, are being dealt with more and more. And in part, they're being dealt with because immigrant communities themselves have taken the lead in Britain and in Holland to get those things addressed.
And in France, too.
And in France,
actually, the head of the mosque in France was totally against it, and he was threatened.
Yeah.
I got 30 seconds to go here. Do you want to weigh in on whether or not the French president's being intolerant on this issue?
Well, it depends on what you think he's saying. And if what you think he's saying is that misogyny is unacceptable in France, and if you accept the premise that the full burqa or niqab can only be the subjugation of women, then he's not being intolerant. So it's partly on that definitional issue. I would say in response to Anna, on the one hand, I take your point. On the other hand, I don't see middle-class people not getting childcare cases on quite the same level as women being forced to cover their body from head to toe.
We're going to have to let that be the last word on this subject today. We could go on for a lot longer. I hope you'll all come back and we'll continue this discussion. Mazen Schwaib, good to see you again, once again, in the nation's capital. Thanks for doing the program tonight. Michael, on the right-hand side of the table, how appropriate. Michael Koren, of the eponymously named Michael Koren Show on CTS. His new book is As I See It. Randall Hansen, University of Toronto, Canada Research Chair in Immigration and Governance. Thanks to you two for being on the program tonight. Anna Korteweg, University of Toronto. How did I do with my Dutch pronunciation tonight? Thank you so much. Okay. Thanks so much, everybody.